The shrill scream of the emergency alarm sliced through the sterile silence of the hospital corridor, sending a ripple of panic through the staff. Nurses and doctors rushed to their designated positions, their faces masked with urgency, their movements swift and purposeful. The fluorescent lights flickered above as if in response to the impending crisis. In the pediatric ICU, the air was thick with tension, filled with the beeping and hissing of machines, each one recording the fight for survival that was playing out before them. In the middle of the chaos lay a small figure on a gurney. Sam, a 7-year-old boy, his face pale and drawn, his tiny body convulsing violently, his hands clenched tightly, his chest heaving with irregular breaths. His life hung by a thread. The seizures that had tormented him for months seemed endless, each one stripping a little more of the boy's vitality. This wasn't just another routine medical emergency. This was a fight against time itself. A battle for a child's future, for a future that seemed to slip further away with each passing second. "Nurse Emma, we're losing him," a panicked resident shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. Emma Thornton, a dedicated and compassionate nurse, moved with the precision of someone who had seen it all, but never without a deep sense of responsibility. She had worked in this hospital for years, and while emergencies like this weren't uncommon, they never got easier. But she didn't flinch. Her hands moved with practiced ease as she snapped on a fresh set of gloves, her eyes locked on Sam's trembling body. Without hesitation, she applied the defibrillator gel to the paddles, charging them. Her heart thudded in her chest, her mind calculating every second, every movement. The room seemed to close in around her, the noise of the machines growing louder, as if amplifying the desperation of the moment. She lowered the paddles to Sam's frail chest, whispering softly, "Sam, you're not going anywhere, little warrior. Not today." Charging to 150. "Clear," she shouted, her voice steady, unwavering. A quick, sharp jolt coursed through Sam's tiny body, but there was no response. The monitor let out a chilling flatline. The room seemed to freeze, as if time itself was holding its breath. Again, charged to 200. "Clear," Emma called out, her tone now tinged with frustration and determination. She wasn't going to give up. Not today. A second jolt, a brief silence, and then a soft, steady heartbeat. It was faint at first, a flutter, a promise of life. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the rhythm returned, slowly, almost painfully. She could feel her own heartbeat echoing in her ears, the relief flooding her chest. The tension in the room began to ease, the crisis averted, at least for now. Emma took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady herself. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached down to brush the damp hair from Sam's forehead. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she whispered softly, her voice cracking with emotion. She leaned in closer, her forehead nearly touching his. "You fought hard. You're a fighter." But behind the glass wall, unnoticed by anyone in the room, a figure stood frozen. Ethan Rivers, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, watched from the shadows. His face was expressionless, his fists clenched tightly by his sides. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were now clouded with something deeper, something unfamiliar. He had been standing there, completely still, watching the scene unfold without making a sound. He was a billionaire entrepreneur, a man whose life had been shaped by technology, power, and control. Yet in this moment, as he watched Emma breathe life back into his son, he felt an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: vulnerability. Ethan had been present, in a sense, for every moment of Sam's medical journey, but always from a distance. He had the resources, the best doctors, the most advanced equipment money could buy. He had built a whole wing of the hospital in Sam's name, hoping that it would provide his son the care he desperately needed. But he couldn't be there for Sam, not like this, not in the way Emma was. In that moment, Ethan realized something profound. He had spent years building walls around himself, around his son, thinking that material wealth could solve everything. But it wasn't the machines or the medications that had saved Sam. It was the compassion, the human touch, the simple act of someone seeing his son as more than just a diagnosis. Ethan's heart tightened as he watched Emma work with such care, her hands gentle and sure, her voice soothing, not as a nurse, but as someone who truly cared for Sam. This woman, with her worn shoes and her simple coat, had done what his wealth and resources never could. She had connected with Sam on a level that Ethan had never been able to. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir inside him, something he had buried under years of business meetings, hospital visits, and cold calculations. It was raw, real, and it unsettled him. He watched as Emma continued to stay by Sam's side, even after her shift ended. She didn't leave, even as exhaustion pulled at her. She stayed because no one else did. Her quiet presence was the thing that Sam needed most. Behind the glass, Ethan's mind raced. How had it come to this? How had a nurse, someone from a world so far removed from his own, become the one person who could make his son feel safe? And what did that mean for him? For his life, for his carefully constructed world? He didn't know the answers, but for the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning everything. The days that followed the emergency were quieter, but the hospital still buzzed with life, each day a series of routines and expectations. For Emma, each step in her care for Sam was a careful dance, a balance between hope and the stark reality of his condition. The boy, though no longer in immediate danger, was still far from stable. But Emma never faltered. She found herself lingering in Sam's room longer than she should, always checking on him when her shift had ended, always staying just a little longer, just to make sure he was okay. Her simple acts of kindness had slowly begun to penetrate Sam's guarded world. He hadn't spoken much, but when Emma quietly sang a lullaby to him, his eyes softened. He didn't reach out, but he listened. That was progress. For the first time in months, Emma felt like she was beginning to make a difference, no matter how small it seemed. Yet, as Emma continued her shifts, there was one constant presence that never left the edges of the room: Ethan Rivers. The tall, composed man in his finely pressed suits would always be there, watching from behind the glass. At first, Emma hadn't noticed him. She was too focused on Sam, too immersed in her work to pay attention to the man who seemed to haunt the hallways. But over time, she became aware of his presence. It was subtle. He would never enter the room, never make a sound. He was the kind of person who blended into the background, always there but never seen. Ethan's silence was deafening in its own way. He was the one who had built everything for Sam: the wing of the hospital, the state-of-the-art equipment, the team of specialists. Yet despite all the money, all the resources, he couldn't provide what Sam needed the most: emotional support, love, and care. Ethan had retreated into his own world, consumed by his work and the desire to fix everything through wealth and technology. His marriage had crumbled under the weight of his detachment, and now his relationship with Sam was a cold, clinical affair. Ethan watched Emma from a distance. Every time she moved around Sam's bed, adjusted his IV, or spoke to him softly, something inside him shifted. He noticed the way Emma didn't treat Sam like a fragile, broken child, but like a person, a boy who deserved tenderness and respect. She wasn't afraid of his condition, and she didn't see him as an inconvenience. She was simply there for him, as a person, not a patient. What struck Ethan the most was Emma's compassion, how genuine it was. In the many months that Sam had been in the hospital, no one had ever stayed the way Emma did. Nurses rotated in and out, constantly changing shifts, but Emma remained. She wasn't like the others who saw Sam's condition as a challenge to be overcome, a medical problem to solve. Emma had become Sam's constant, his anchor, and Ethan could see it in the way Sam's expression softened when she spoke to him. She was the first person to make Sam feel seen, not as a burden, not as a diagnosis, but as a boy who needed care and love. One evening, as Emma read to Sam from a worn-out copy of Charlotte's Web, Ethan stood silently behind the glass wall, watching the scene unfold. His heart tightened as he watched Sam's eyes focus on the pages. For the first time in a long while, Sam was engaged, his attention riveted to Emma's voice as she spoke the words softly. It was such a simple moment, yet to Ethan, it was the most powerful one he had witnessed in years. He hadn't seen his son so present, so connected, in a long time. For all his wealth, for all the resources he had thrown at Sam's condition, it was this simple, quiet interaction that had brought Sam back to life in a way Ethan had never been able to. Ethan's feelings were complicated. He was grateful to Emma for what she had done, but at the same time, he resented her for making him realize how far he had drifted from his son. His wealth, his empire, had never been able to replace the emotional connection Sam needed. He had thrown money at his son's condition, built the finest hospital wing, and surrounded him with the best medical experts. But it was Emma, the nurse with her tattered shoes and humble demeanor, who had done what his fortune never could. She had touched Sam's heart. As the days passed, Ethan continued to watch from his vantage point, unable to pull himself away. His fascination with Emma grew, not out of any romantic interest, but because of the way she was able to connect with Sam in a way he never could. He saw the bond growing between them, and it troubled him in ways he couldn't articulate. He was used to being in control, used to dictating outcomes, but Emma had done something he couldn't control. She had bridged the gap between Sam and the world. And in doing so, she had made Ethan face the truth about his own failure as a father. One evening, after Sam had been sedated, and Emma was sitting quietly beside his bed, Ethan stepped forward, his footsteps soft against the linoleum floor. Emma looked up, startled to see him standing in the doorway. Her first instinct was to step back, but she stood her ground. She had spent enough time with Sam to understand that he needed her, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even his father, change that. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching her face as if trying to read her thoughts. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "You've done more for my son than anyone else. I can't explain it, but you've brought something out of him that no amount of money or technology could." Emma looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. For the first time, she saw Ethan as a man, not a billionaire CEO. He was a father who had failed to connect with his child, a man who had buried his emotions under layers of success and ambition. And in that moment, Emma realized that, like Sam, Ethan was also in need of healing. Days rolled into weeks, and with each passing shift, Emma found herself more deeply entwined in Sam's world. It wasn't just about the medical care anymore. It was about the quiet moments, the ones that passed unnoticed by most, but not by her. She wasn't there to cure him with machines or procedures. She was there to offer something far more elusive: presence. With every passing day, she stayed longer, read more stories, and whispered words of encouragement during the times Sam's seizures gripped him. Her bond with him grew, not through spoken words, but through the silence they shared. Sam, for the first time in a long while, was beginning to open up, not vocally, but emotionally. When Emma came into the room, his eyes no longer stared blankly at the wall, but instead followed her every move. His fingers, once clenched tightly with fear, now opened when she reached for them. His small hand would occasionally brush against hers, a gesture of trust, however brief. And Emma, in return, learned to understand this silence, this quiet language that Sam had created to shield himself from a world that had often let him down. Meanwhile, outside the small world of the ITU room, Emma's life continued in its modest rhythm. Her apartment was small, simple, a world away from the grandeur that Ethan lived in, yet it had everything she needed. Her grandmother, a constant figure in her life, had watched her grow into the woman she had become. Emma would visit her every evening after work, share her day, and listen as her grandmother spoke about the struggles of life, the importance of kindness, and the power of small, unnoticed acts. Emma's relationship with her grandmother had always been one of quiet understanding. Her grandmother had taught her that real beauty wasn't found in wealth or fame, but in the quiet moments of compassion and humility. It was advice that Emma lived by every day, especially in the way she cared for Sam. She didn't see Sam as a sick child. She saw him as a young soul in need of healing, a healing that for her had little to do with machines and medication and everything to do with the connection between them. But no matter how much she poured into Sam, no matter how deeply she became involved, Emma never once expected anything in return. For her, the reward was in the small victories, the flicker of recognition in Sam's eyes, the small smile that would appear at the corner of his lips when she placed a paper crane on his bedside tray. She had learned long ago that giving with no expectation was its own kind of healing. It was on one of these quiet days, as Emma sat beside Sam, reading a dog-eared copy of The Little Prince, that Ethan found himself stepping closer. He had been watching from the doorway, as he had so many times before, but today something felt different. Today, there was an unfamiliar tightness in his chest as he saw Emma sitting by Sam's bed, her voice soft as she read the words. Sam's gaze, usually distant and withdrawn, was focused on her face, his expression more serene than Ethan had ever seen it. Ethan knew the statistics, the reports, the numbers. But today, he saw something far beyond that. He saw his son listening, truly listening, not just to the words Emma was reading, but to her presence, to the way she had become a constant in his life. He saw the way Emma had bridged a gap that no amount of medical intervention could ever fill. She had done what Ethan had never been able to do. She had made Sam feel human again, not just a diagnosis to be managed. "Emma," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm as he entered the room. She looked up, startled by his presence. For a moment, her heart skipped. She wasn't used to Ethan coming into Sam's room. It felt intrusive, and yet there was something different in the way he stood there now. She could see it in his eyes, the same emotion that had stirred in him from the moment he first saw her care for Sam. Emma stood up, her hand still resting gently on Sam's. "Mr. Rivers," she began, but Ethan raised a hand, silencing her. "Please call me Ethan," he said softly. "I've been watching you," he continued, his voice catching slightly. "I see how you've been with Sam, how you've been with him, when no one else stayed. I don't know how to thank you." Emma felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She wasn't here for thanks. She never had been. "I'm just doing my job," she said quietly, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I care about him. That's all." Ethan shook his head. "No," he said, his voice low but intense. "You've done more than that. You've given him something I couldn't, something no doctor or machine could. You've given him a reason to hope." Emma looked down at Sam, whose eyes were half closed, still lost in the dreamlike world she had created for him with her voice. He had been so quiet, so withdrawn. And yet here he was, his tiny hand gently resting in hers, his face at peace. Ethan watched them for a moment, his mind racing. His heart, which had been locked away for so long, was beginning to stir. He had created everything for Sam: money, machines, care. But it was Emma, the nurse from a world so different from his own, who had made his son smile again. He had never been able to do that. The realization hit him like a wave. "I don't know what to say," Ethan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I do know this. You've changed him. And you've changed me too." Emma met his gaze, surprised by the rawness in his eyes. She had never imagined that someone like Ethan Rivers, a man who had everything, would need the kind of healing she had been offering. But here he was, admitting that he too was broken, that he too had been waiting for someone to fill the space his son had created in his heart. And for the first time in a long time, Emma saw Ethan not as a billionaire, but as a father who had been lost, just like his son. The days after their conversation were different. The hospital no longer felt like just a place where Emma went to work. It had become something much more, a place where a bond had formed, where lives had intertwined, and where everything had changed in the most subtle yet powerful way. Emma could feel the shift in the air, a change she couldn't quite put into words. It was as if the walls of the hospital, so cold and clinical before, had begun to echo with warmth, hope, and the possibility of something more than just recovery. Every morning, Emma still made the same walk to the hospital, her shoes worn, her coat thin against the bite of the early morning wind. But now there was a sense of anticipation she had never felt before. She wasn't just heading to work, she was heading to a place where she was needed. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She wasn't just the nurse who did her job well. She was the person who had made a difference in Sam's life. And more than that, she had made a difference in Ethan's life. It was early one morning when Ethan approached her again, a quiet determination in his steps. Emma had just finished adjusting the sheets on Sam's bed when he appeared in the doorway. She looked up, slightly startled by his presence, but smiled softly. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, her voice steady but warm. Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on Sam, who was still asleep, his chest rising and falling with each breath. "I've been thinking," Ethan began, his voice low but firm, "about what you said, about how you've been with Sam, and how I've been with him." Emma stayed silent, unsure of where this conversation was going. Her heart pounded slightly, the familiarity of Ethan's presence now tempered by the weight of the conversation that lay ahead. "I've spent so much time thinking I could fix everything with money, with technology, with control," Ethan continued, his gaze never leaving Sam. "But none of that mattered. Not when it came to him. Not when it came to making him feel seen. You've given him something I never could. Connection. You've helped him feel like he belongs in this world again, not just as a sick child, but as a person. You've given him something I couldn't buy." Emma felt a lump form in her throat. It wasn't the words, but the raw honesty behind them that took her by surprise. Ethan, the man who seemed impervious to everything, was admitting his flaws, his vulnerability. She hadn't expected that. "You've done more than any machine or medical procedure could," Ethan said, turning to face her now, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "You've brought him back to life, Emma. Not through medicine, but through care, through something real. And for that, I can't thank you enough." Emma took a deep breath, looking down at her shoes, trying to gather her thoughts. She had never been someone who sought recognition, and hearing these words from Ethan made her feel both grateful and uncomfortable. "I'm just doing my job," she replied softly. "I care about Sam. I care about him like I would care for anyone. That's all." Ethan watched her for a moment, his eyes reflecting something she couldn't quite place. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I want to offer you something, Emma," he said, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "You've become so much more than just a nurse to us. To Sam, you're his lifeline. I know you didn't come here for recognition, but I'm offering you something I believe is right. I'd like you to come and work with us. Not as a nurse in the hospital, but as a private caretaker for Sam. I want you to stay with him, to be there for him when he needs you the most. No distractions, no board meetings, no cameras, just you and him." Emma stood still, her heart racing. The offer was unexpected, and yet it felt right. She looked at Sam, still peacefully asleep in his bed, and the thought of being there for him, not just in the hospital, but as a constant presence in his life, stirred something deep within her. "I don't know what to say," Emma said softly, her voice catching in her throat. "You're asking me to change my entire life, Ethan." "I know," he replied, his voice calm but sincere. "But you've already changed our lives, Emma. You've changed everything for Sam, and I think you can change everything for me too." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the offer, the significance of what it meant, hung in the air between them. Emma wasn't sure how to respond, but she knew this was more than just a job offer. It was an invitation to step into a new world, A world where she could continue to care for Sam in the way only she could, and perhaps a chance to help heal the man who had been hiding behind his empire. I need some time to think," Emma finally said, her voice quieter than before. "This is a huge decision." "I understand," Ethan said, nodding. "Take all the time you need, but know that the offer stands." As Ethan turned to leave the room, Emma couldn't help but feel a swirl of emotions. This was not a life she had ever imagined for herself. But as she looked at Sam, his peaceful face illuminated by the soft light coming from the window, she knew she had already made her decision. It wasn't about the money, the grandeur of Ethan's world, or the security he could offer. It was about Sam. It was about being there for him in a way no one else could. It was about making a difference, not through titles or prestige, but through love, presence, and connection. And so, the next day, Emma made her choice. She would stay, not as a nurse, but as a mother, a guide, and a protector. For Sam, for herself, and perhaps in time, for Ethan as well. As Emma walked down the hospital hallway later that evening, her steps felt lighter, her heart fuller. She wasn't sure where this new chapter would lead, but she knew it was the right path. And for the first time in a long time, she believed in the possibility of a future built not on money or status, but on the quiet power of love and connection. Her new life was just beginning.